Hola. Hyvät ystävät.
Yes, dear friends. I was told that I'm a senior, and that's true. I've been working in this field from the 1970s, less and less lately. But anyway, my first perspective is that we have long, winding, complicated roads towards change. That applies to everything. Change takes years, even decades. This is not a sprint, it's a marathon. And that is an approach that allows you to think how to progress. If you look at that long time span, of course, that is no explanation for neglecting change or development or trying to improve. What I've noticed along the way is that now that we have a common judicial basis for our work and for the work that we do with persons with disabilities, and this is through the CRPD, I would not like to minimize the importance of that. Lately, I have had some time and I've been reading Snyder's books, or a book on what happens when these structures fracture and we start to operate without common principles or common rules. The CRPD is a good starting point, a good foundation for us in order to develop, and that is, of course, common to nearly everybody in the world. I won't go into any more detail on the CRPD because I think most of you know it, but I just wanted to remind you that it exists and that it's a key foundation for the work of all of us. And experiences from Finland, that's what we want to talk about how things have developed here over the decades. And the journey has been long, as it has in many other places. I have found some historical documents and literature, even from the 1890s. I have found records where they have identified and acknowledged the fact that people with disabilities are still individuals, they are still people, and that the differing characteristics or capabilities of people should be recognized also in relation with other people, and that we are all individuals and that should be respected. But then for a long time, we were not able to act on that foundation. For a long, long time, we weren't able to think that a person with disabilities should participate in deciding on their own care, on their own affairs with support. I think that is one of the hot topics during the past few years and decades. And it has been difficult to understand what is actually very simple, that this is a question of somebody's life, their self-determination, and it has been quite confusing really to understand that people think about persons with disabilities as sort of standard people who have exactly the same needs as each other, and that they don't need anything of their own, and understanding all that history, everything that goes with it, has been very, very difficult. And acknowledging that that has been the foundation of the way we act. It has been very easy to start with institutions from their perspective, from the ideas and thoughts of experts. That has been very easy. I think I skipped a slide here. Yes, then next. Here we are. So in Finland, there was a period for creating large institutions starting from 1890 and going all the way to 1980. And that activity was actually at its peak from the 1950s to the 1970s. Then we were still building these large institutions. In the beginning, the idea or purpose of the institutions was to have sorts of boarding schools to make people with disabilities into useful workers. And the idea of eugenics spread to Finland at the beginning of the last century. But luckily, it wasn't manifested quite as strongly as it did in Germany, for example. But there was this concept of isolation that was related to it quite strongly, and that has left a strong and quite painful mark in society. And it really defined institutions as social organizations. There was a very strong authoritative tradition. Another tradition that went along with it was the perspective of care that was just talked about in the previous speech, and that was based on the idea of Christian charity and how that should be implemented. And these types of institutions were created, several of them in fact at that time. And then in the 1960s, we received the legislative basis for institutions and institutional care. And at that time, it was understood to be rehabilitation. At the beginning of my career, all the way until the 1980s and 90s, people who had been advocating for institutions and felt that they were one of the biggest achievements in their lives, in their political careers, they felt that it was quite unfathomable why somebody would like to give up these institutions now. I had many interesting discussions with people trying to explain why that road is now finished. At the background here, we have many different routes, many different paths that have created the idea of institutionalization. And I don't think we are quite at the end of those ideas as yet. As the previous speaker said, it's a mindset. I think that's a very good way of describing it. Okay, next slide.
Ajattelu ja toiminta alkoi vähitellen 1960-luvulla muun yhteiskunnan muutoksen myötä.
In the 1960s and 70s, society. The society started to change, and then this activity started to change with it. And in social services, there was a strong discussion on when it was suitable to force people to do something or not. We had a pamphlet that created a lot of discussion. It talked about forcing help on somebody. It talked about the institutionalization of persons with disabilities and what problems that could create. The International Year of Disabled Persons in 1981 was significant. In my career, I remember that was the first time when we actually created a project to try to raise awareness for this topic. And then after that, there were legal reforms and thinking concerning individual service plans. Children with intellectual disabilities were able to go to school in 1984, I think, and personal assistance came along. That was other than just giving new services. That really changed people's thinking. And personal assistance entered our legislation in 1988. In 1995 in Finland, our constitution stated that you cannot discriminate anyone because of their disability.
This change took place rather late, but it was very important nevertheless. Towards the end of the 1980s, the first large institutions were run down, and in two first wind down projects, I was involved in them. The deinstitutionalization was really confusing for many people because they thought that the institutions were the best thing they were ever able to offer these people, and now all of a sudden they had to give up on them. And of course, the solution was group homes and other types of things that Simon and Alastair referred to. Small group homes were built, various other residential services and other community services. What was interesting was that Finns were very eager to build houses and very skilled into doing that. They still are. They can build any kind of house, and the buildings themselves are designed very carefully. There are piles and piles of designs for building the house itself, but in retrospect, I have to say that we didn't really know how to plan the activities, what we would be doing together with persons with disabilities. That was something that we actually didn't think much about at all. And actually, the practices and procedures employed in institutions were transferred into the new units in the same form as they had been applied before. We did study this, and we found that those professionals who had the strongest professional identity and the strongest confidence in their abilities and skills, they were the most successful in the new environments, in the new housing solutions, but those who were uncertain about their own professional identity, they were more likely to resort to institutionalized practices, and they were more likely to just transfer the institutionalized mindset into the new environment. All right, let's move to the next slide. Development or change is seldom linear, so that we would always be moving to a better solution. When there is progress in some areas, it easily happens that there is regression in others, that we slide back to the old practices. And in Finland, this is largely related to the issue of who is providing services. In the until the 1990s, the provision of services was largely the task of municipalities and municipal local authorities and various nonprofit organizations such as foundations and NGOs. The role of foundations and NGOs was in fact quite significant in the beginning. I was referring to charity earlier. But in the 1990s, there was a shift towards favoring a setup where the services would be provided as for-profit business by various companies. This was true not only of elderly people and people with disabilities, but also it was related to child protection. And of course, this change cannot only be said to be bad or good. It has many sides. One thing was that persons with disabilities were increasingly thought of as clients of a business. And of course, this served to raise the question about what the client needs. That's the positive side of the thing. That's the side that opens up possibilities and opportunities. But on the other hand, as these various businesses and service providers receive their funding from municipalities and the central government, it was perhaps the case that what became more important than the clienthood of the people with disabilities was public procurement. Public procurement processes in which there was an effort to solve the problem of people's needs for a large group of people at the same time. Because when a municipality procures services, they don't procure that service for one individual only, they procure it for dozens or hundreds of people. So that easily leads to a mass approach. So there were both positive opportunities and negative threats related to the idea of the person as a client, because it was the companies and the authorities who largely defined what was relevant in the life of the person with disabilities. Let's move forward. self-directed support and entered the debate in Finland, and other ideas based on self-determination and inclusion entered the Finnish debate some 10 plus years ago. KVPS has been very active in this, and various experiments started about 10 years ago. There has been a lot of interest in adopting such initiatives, but motivations have varied. On the one hand, there has been the idea that this would help save public funds. On the other hand, there has been the idea that it would be possible to increase the self-determination possibilities of individuals and to find solutions that would suit the individuals and the community's needs. Over the past 15 years, a powerful privately run care industry has developed. The companies themselves speak about a care industry, and they have established various kinds of group homes with beautiful names. Where the approach, however, is very institutionalized, so we're actually talking about neo-institutions. This is perhaps the turn towards the past, in a way. And of course, these groups homes involve opportunities, and the continuity of such institutions is not as strong as was that of the large old-fashioned institutions, because there is also a strong emphasis on public procurement. So the public authorities can discontinue purchasing services from these smaller institutions. That's much easier than to dismantle a large institution. But this also has a major impact on the lives of many people. And in the long term, this may not be as fatal a mistake as the mistakes made in the large institutions. But I think that there is reason to be optimistic, and the human rights approach has taken root. There are institutional structures that protect human rights and defend human rights, but we have not been brave enough to give up on the institutionalized mindset. We still think very much through that mindset, and I think this is one of the most important lessons to be learned, that we need to work on. Together with Simon's lessons, we need to learn to give up on that mindset and start building solutions for people that are really truly individualized and that serve their needs. In Finland, in many parts of Finland, actually the population is growing sparser and older, and there are no possibilities any longer for large-scale institutions, perhaps not even small-scale institutions. So we have a real opportunity to learn to do things differently. This is really a good opportunity. But I thank you for your attention, and I'm ready to take questions.